The year was 1879, and the world for Arthur Blackwood had shrunk to the size of his grief. It was a parcel of land staked out not by fences, but by the horizon, where the prairie met a sky that was too vast, too empty. His farm was an island in a sea of whispering grass, a solitary bastion against the silence that had taken up residence in his house the day he buried Eleanor. The wind, his only constant neighbor, howled around the eaves of the small cabin like a thing grieving with him, a mournful chorus to his solitary existence. He had come here with her, lured by the promise of a life carved from the earth with their own two hands. They had built this place together, every plank of the cabin, every post of the corral, a testament to a shared dream. Now, it was just a repository of ghosts. Her presence lingered in the faint scent of dried lavender she'd kept in a bowl on the mantel, in the way the morning light still fell across the empty side of their bed, in the worn patch on the floorboard by the hearth where she used to sit and mend his shirts. Arthur moved through these memories like a phantom himself, his calloused hands performing the endless rituals of survival, chopping wood, drawing water, tending the meager livestock with a mechanical efficiency that belied the hollowness within. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts. The laughter and easy warmth that had once defined him were gone, planed away by loss until only a hard, unyielding grain remained. His conversations were with the chickens he fed or the stubborn mule that pulled his plow, short, gruff commands that demanded nothing back. The nearest town, Prescott, was a 2-day ride, a journey he made only when supplies ran so low that hunger became a sharper pain than loneliness. The townsfolk saw a gaunt, bearded man with eyes that held the flat, distant look of the plains themselves. They sold him flour and salt, took his money, and asked no questions. Men like him were common enough on the frontier, men running from something, or men with nothing left to run to. His days were a litany of labor, a physical exhaustion he courted in the hopes it would grant him dreamless sleep. But the nights were the hardest. In the crushing silence of the cabin, the grief was a physical weight. It was in those hours that he felt the absence of Eleanor most acutely. The lack of her soft breathing beside him, the missing warmth of her hand in his. It was a silence so profound it seemed to have its own sound, a low hum of absolute emptiness. There was one object in the house he refused to touch, a small rosewood box that sat on the shelf above their bed, Eleanor's music box. Her father had given it to her, and its delicate, tinkling melody had been the soundtrack to their life here. She would wind it in the evenings, and the sweet, crystalline notes would fill the small cabin, a fragile shield against the vast, wild emptiness outside. Since her death, it had remained silent. To open it, to hear that song again without her, felt like a betrayal he could not stomach. The box, like his heart, remained closed, gathering a fine layer of prairie dust, a tiny casket for a melody he could no longer bear to hear. His life was a stasis, a long, unchanging note of sorrow, held until his lungs gave out. It was on a sweltering afternoon in late summer that the note finally changed. He was riding the southern fence line, the one that bordered the lands the government had promised the Lakota, but which white men increasingly ignored. The air was thick and still, heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm that refused to break. Heat shimmered above the tall grass, making the world waver and distort. He was checking for posts loosened by the hard, dry ground when his horse, a steady bay named Jasper, suddenly shied, snorting in alarm. Arthur's hand went instinctively to the rifle holstered on his saddle, his eyes scanning the landscape. At first, he saw nothing but the endless roll of the prairie. Then he saw it. A dark shape crumpled near the fence, almost lost in the deep grass. It was a horse, its legs bent at unnatural angles, its labored breathing a ragged, rattling sound that was quickly fading. And beside it, sprawled in the dust, was a man. He dismounted slowly, his rifle held ready. Caution was a reflex etched into him by the unforgiving nature of this land. He approached with the wary tread of a man who knew that survival often depended on what you walked away from. The man on the ground was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and hardship, his long, grey hair unbound and matted with dirt. He was Lakota. He wore leather leggings and a simple tunic, both worn and dusty from long travel. He was not moving. Arthur circled him, his gaze sharp, assessing. There was no visible weapon, only a small leather pouch tied to his belt. One of his legs was horribly swollen, the flesh around a deep, festering gash, a dark, angry purple. The man's eyes were closed, his lips cracked and blistered. A faint, shuddering breath escaped them, a sign he was still alive, but only just. Arthur nudged the man's shoulder with the toe of his boot. There was no response, save for a low, feverish moan. He stood over him for a long time, the sun beating down on his neck. A war raged within him. His mind, the part of him conditioned by fear and prejudice, the part that listened to the fearful whispers in town, screamed at him to ride away. This was not his problem. This was a danger he had no business inviting into his life. Bringing a Lakota, even a dying one, to his farm was an act of profound foolishness. His people would come looking for him. There would be questions, accusations, violence. But then another voice, a quieter one he had not heard in a long time, spoke. It was the part of him that remembered Eleanor's kindness, the part of him that had held her as she slipped away, helpless to do anything but bear witness. He looked down at the old man's face, at the way his chest hitched with each painful breath, and he saw not an enemy, but simply a man at the end of his road, dying alone under an indifferent sun. To leave him here was to sentence him to a slow, agonizing death. It was a cruelty Arthur found, to his own surprise, he was not capable of. With a heavy sigh that was part curse, part prayer, he holstered his rifle. The routine was broken, his isolation was about to be breached. Getting the man onto Jasper's back was a monumental effort. The elder was light, his body frail with age and sickness, but he was dead weight, limp and unresponsive. Arthur grunted and strained, his muscles protesting, the sweat stinging his eyes. He finally managed to heave the man over the saddle, tying him loosely with a rope to keep him from sliding off. He left the dead horse where it lay. The vultures would have it before nightfall. Leading Jasper by the reins, he began the slow walk back to the farm, the unconscious form a heavy burden on his horse and a heavier one on his mind. He had crossed a line, and he had no idea what lay on the other side. He did not take the man into the house. That felt like too great a violation of the space that was still in his heart, Eleanor's. The barn would have to do. He laid the elder down on a bed of clean straw in an empty stall, the air thick with the scent of hay and animals. He fetched a blanket from the house, a rough, woolen one, not one of the quilts Eleanor had made, and covered the frail body. For the rest of the day, Arthur moved in a fog of tense uncertainty. He performed his chores with one eye always on the barn, his ears straining for any sound. He was a sentry in his own home, guarding against a threat he had willingly invited in. The silence he had once found so oppressive was now charged with a new kind of tension, the quiet hum of a stranger's breathing from across the yard. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, he knew he had to do more. The man's leg was the source of the poison that was killing him. Arthur had seen infections like it before in livestock. If it was not cleaned, the fever would consume him. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight. He boiled water over the stove, found clean rags, and took the steaming bucket and a bottle of whiskey to the barn. The elder's name, he would later learn, was Chayton, but for now he was just a nameless, dying man. Arthur knelt beside him on the straw-strewn floor. He gently cut away the leather of the legging around the wound. The smell that rose from it was foul, the scent of decay. He poured a little of the whiskey onto a rag and, steeling himself, began to clean the wound. Chayton's body convulsed at the fiery touch of the alcohol. His eyes fluttered open, dark and delirious with fever. A string of guttural words, incomprehensible to Arthur, spilled from his lips. It was not a cry of anger, but of pure, abject pain. Arthur didn't stop. He worked methodically, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cleaned away the filth, his face a grim mask of concentration. He had done this for calves and foals, a grim necessity of farm life, but this was different. This was an act of care for a man he should have considered an enemy. When he was finished, he bandaged the leg with clean strips of cloth. He tried to get some water between the man's cracked lips, tipping the ladle carefully. A little trickled down Chayton's throat. It wasn't much, but it was something. Arthur sat back on his heels, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The man's breathing was still shallow, his skin burning to the touch. Arthur had done what he could. The rest was not in his hands. He spent the night in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the stall, his shotgun resting across his knees. He didn't sleep. He listened to the old man's tortured breathing, a rasping counterpoint to the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. At some point in the deep, starless dark, Chayton began to mutter again. It was the same fevered delirium, but this time, in the midst of the strange, flowing words, Arthur heard a name repeated over and over. Wachiwi, Wachiwi. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the tone. He had whispered Eleanor's name in the same way in the lonely nights after she was gone. It was a sound of profound loss, a name dredged up from the deepest well of memory and love. In that moment, the barrier of race, of fear, of prejudice, thinned to almost nothing. In the shared darkness of the barn, they were not a white farmer and a Lakota warrior. They were two men, haunted by the names of the women they had lost. For 2 days, this strange vigil continued. Arthur tended to the wound, forced water and thin broth past the old man's lips, and kept watch. He moved between the house and the barn, his world shrunk to this singular, consuming task. The farm, his grief, the vast, empty prairiet, all faded into the background, replaced by the simple, urgent reality of keeping another human being alive. He felt a reluctant connection forming, an unspoken bond forged in the crucible of sickness and care. He was no longer just guarding against a threat, he was fighting for a life. On the third night, a change occurred. The terrible heat of the fever seemed to break, but it was not a sign of recovery. It was the body giving up its fight. Chayton's breathing became a faint, shallow flutter, a candle flame flickering in a draught. Arthur knew the signs. He had seen this with Eleanor, the final, quiet letting go. He knelt by the old man's side, a feeling of profound helplessness washing over him. He had failed. His efforts had only prolonged the suffering. He looked at Chayton's face, peaceful now in the lantern light, and was overcome by a need to offer some final comfort, some small measure of grace in this lonely, desolate place. Medicine had failed. Words were useless. What else was there? And then he remembered, the rosewood box on the shelf, Eleanor's music. He stood up and walked with a purpose he hadn't felt in over a year. He strode into the cabin, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He reached up to the dusty shelf, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood of the box. His hands trembled as he took it down. It felt both foreign and deeply familiar. He ran his thumb over the small brass key, wiping away the film of dust. For a year, this box had been a monument to his pain, a symbol of what he had lost. Now, it felt like the only thing he had left to give. He carried it back to the barn, his heart pounding a strange, heavy rhythm in his chest. He knelt once more in the straw beside the dying man. He looked from Chayton's still face to the box in his hands. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a breath that felt like it was pulling up a year's worth of unshed tears. He turned the key. A series of soft clicks, and then the melody began. It was a simple, sweet tune, a Viennese waltz that seemed impossibly delicate in the rugged, masculine space of the barn. The tinkling notes fell into the heavy silence, clear and pure as winter stars. They were notes of another world, a world of ballrooms and civilized grace, so out of place here and yet, somehow, perfect. Arthur closed his eyes. The music was not just for the dying man beside him. It was for Eleanor. It was a prayer, a farewell, a final, painful release. He let the melody wash over him, each note a memory, each phrase a ghost of laughter or a shared glance. He was playing it for his grief, for the crushing loneliness, for the love that still ached in his chest like a phantom limb. He was playing it for himself. He did not know if Chayton could hear it. The old man's breathing was a mere whisper now, but as the music played on, a sense of profound peace seemed to settle over his features. The lines of pain softened. A long, gentle sigh escaped his lips, a final release. Arthur kept winding the box, playing the song over and over as the night deepened, the fragile melody a lone anchor in the vast, silent ocean of the prairie. He played until the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, and he knew, without having to check, that he was alone again. Chayton was gone. The music had stopped. The silence that rushed back in was different now, heavier. It was the silence of death. Arthur sat for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the morning sunbeams slanting through the barn. He felt a hollow ache, but it was not the sharp, jagged edge of his grief for Eleanor. It was a softer, more somber sorrow for the man he had barely known, but for whom he had stood a final, intimate watch. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave the body for the elements. It would be a desecration. He would give the old man a proper burial on the rise behind the cabin, a spot with a view of the rising sun. He gently wrapped Chayton's body in the woolen blanket, a final act of respect. He laid the music box on the straw beside the shrouded form, its purpose served. He walked out of the barn and into the bright, unforgiving light of a new day, his shovel in his hand, his mind on the hard work of digging a grave. But as he stepped into the yard, he froze. His blood ran cold. He dropped the shovel with a dull thud. Lining the ridge that marked the northern edge of his property, silhouetted against the morning sky, were riders. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. They sat motionless on their ponies, a silent, terrifying frieze of feathered lances and stoic forms. They were too far to see their faces, but he knew who they were. Lakota, a war party. They weren't attacking, they were just watching, waiting. A wave of pure, primal fear seized him. They had come for their elder. They had found him here, on the land of a white man, dead. The story his mind wrote in that instant was brutal and swift. They would see the cleaned wound, the shelter of the barn, not as acts of mercy, but as a failed attempt to save a man he had somehow harmed. They would see him as a kidnapper, a murderer. The compassion he had shown, the small bridge he had tried to build across a chasm of mistrust, was about to become his own funeral pyre. He was trapped. His small cabin offered no real defense against such a force. His rifle, with its handful of cartridges, was a child's toy against this silent army. Every fearful story he had ever heard, every prejudice he had ever harbored, rose up like bile in his throat. He had been a fool, an utter, sentimental fool. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the ridge, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence from the ridge was more menacing than any war cry. It was the silence of judgment. The hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the tense tableau. Arthur stayed near his cabin, moving from the window to the door, his rifle now clutched in his sweaty hands. The warriors did not move. Their stillness was a form of torture, a tightening knot of suspense that stretched his nerves to the breaking point. He was a lone man on a checkerboard, and a king had just been taken. He was surrounded, and checkmate felt inevitable. He thought about making a run for it, but where would he go? The prairie offered no cover. They would ride him down in minutes. He thought about barricading himself inside the cabin, to die fighting in a prison of his own making. But the thought of it felt hollow, a pointless act of defiance. He had not sought this confrontation. He had done what he felt was right, and this was the consequence. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, there was movement on the ridge. a small party of 5 riders detached itself from the main group and began to descend the gentle slope toward his farm. They moved not with the chaotic speed of an attack, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was somehow even more terrifying. Arthur's mouth went dry. This was it, the parley, the verdict. He watched them approach, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. The lead rider was a man in his prime, his face stern and proud, his muscular frame radiating an aura of command. He wore a feathered war bonnet that signified a position of great authority. This was a chief or a great warrior. As they drew closer, Arthur made a decision. It was not born of courage, but of a sudden, profound exhaustion. He was tired of fear, he was tired of hiding. He laid his rifle carefully on the porch swing. He straightened his shoulders and walked out into the yard, his hands empty and open at his sides. He would not meet them with a weapon. He would meet them as he was, a man alone on his land, with nothing to offer but the truth. The 5 riders halted a dozen yards from him. They dismounted in unison, their movements fluid and confident. The lead warrior, the one with the bonnet, stepped forward. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Arthur, the cabin, the entire farm, taking in every detail. They were eyes that missed nothing. He was a man named Tashunka, though Arthur did not know it. He was Chaitan's son. Tashunka said nothing. His expression was a mask of stone, unreadable, impenetrable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions and imminent violence. Arthur's heart pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of the hundreds of eyes still watching from the ridge. Summoning a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed, Arthur broke the silence. He did not speak. He simply met Tashunka's gaze for a long moment, then turned and nodded slowly toward the open door of the barn. It was a gesture of complete surrender, an invitation to see for himself. There were no tricks. There were no lies. There was only what was. Tashunka held his gaze for another heartbeat, then gave a curt nod to the men behind him. 2 of them remained with the horses, while he and the other 2 walked past Arthur and into the barn. Arthur did not follow. He stood his ground in the yard, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the judgment to be passed. He heard their soft footsteps on the straw-covered floor, a low murmur of voices speaking in their own tongue. The waiting was an eternity. Then Tashunka reappeared in the doorway, the shadows of the barn behind him. He stood there for a moment, his formidable frame blocking the light. In his hand, he held the rosewood music box. He stepped out into the sun, his eyes fixed on Arthur. He walked toward him, his expression no longer stony, but filled with a complex mixture of grief, confusion, and something else Arthur could not name. He stopped directly in front of Arthur. He held up the music box. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, the words foreign to Arthur's ears. Then one of the warriors beside him, a younger man, stepped forward to translate. "He asks," the young man said, his English halting but clear, "if this was your magic." Arthur was bewildered. "Magic? It's a music box." The translator relayed his words. Tashunka shook his head slightly, his eyes still locked on Arthur. He spoke again, a longer string of words this time, his tone imbued with a strange reverence. "Our trackers found the trail of his horse 2 days ago," the translator explained. "We followed. We saw your farm. We saw no attack. We saw you care for him. We waited. This morning, we felt his spirit pass. We came to bring him home." He paused, gesturing with his chin toward the box in Tashunka's hand. "The wind carried a sound to us on the ridge last night, a spirit song. We have never heard such a song. Was it this? Did you sing his spirit to the next world?" The truth dawned on Arthur with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't heard the melody as music. They had heard it as something sacred. They believed the delicate, tinkling waltz was a powerful hymn, a ritual he had performed to ease the passage of their elder's soul. They didn't see the death of their respected elder in a white man's barn as an insult. They saw the clean wound, the shelter, the blanket, and the mysterious, beautiful song as evidence of a profoundly respectful and holy death. Arthur could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He could not explain the truth, that it was just a keepsake, a vessel for his own grief. The misunderstanding was too vast, too sacred to correct. In their eyes, he was not a farmer, but a man of spiritual power. Tushunka looked from the box to Arthur, and for the first time, Arthur saw the grief in the warrior's eyes, raw and deep. He saw the gratitude. Tushunka spoke one final word directly to Arthur, a word that needed no translation. Pila Maye, thank you. He then turned and walked back toward his men, cradling the music box as if it were a holy relic. They entered the barn to gently retrieve their father's body. Arthur watched, stunned into immobility, as they carried Chaitan's shrouded form out into the sunlight. They lashed the body carefully to a horse for the journey home. The great war party on the ridge had seen the peaceful exchange. They began to move, not in attack, but in a slow, solemn procession down the slope. What happened next would be seared into Arthur's memory for the rest of his days. Led by Tushunka, the warriors began to file past him. They moved with a quiet dignity, their ponies shuffling in the dust. And as each warrior passed, he would leave something at Arthur's feet. The first left a thick, warm buffalo robe. Another laid down a string of smoked fish, a brace of wild turkeys, a stack of perfectly cured beaver pelts, a beautifully beaded sheath for a knife. The gifts piled up, moccasins softer than any leather he had ever felt, a pouch of tobacco, dried berries and roots. One warrior, without a word, dismounted his own fine-looking paint horse, tied its reins to Arthur's fence post, and then mounted double with a friend. It went on, a silent, steady river of gratitude. Hundreds of men, faces stoic, but their actions speaking with an eloquence that humbled him to his very soul. They were not paying for a service. They were bestowing honor. These were not mere goods. They were priceless gifts, the currency of a people who valued respect and spiritual debt above all else. They were honoring the man who had given their elder, their father, a spirit song for his journey. When the last warrior had passed, and the long procession was receding back into the prairie, Tushunka rode up to him one final time. He held out the rosewood music box. Arthur reached for it, but Tushunka held it for a moment longer, his eyes conveying a message of shared understanding, of a debt that was now paid. He placed the box gently into Arthur's trembling hands and, without another word, turned and rode to join his people, disappearing over the ridge. Arthur stood alone in his yard, surrounded by an impossible bounty. The silence returned, but it was utterly changed. It was not the empty, oppressive silence of grief. It was a rich, resonant silence, vibrating with the memory of what had just happened. The land no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, and not in a menacing way. He was no longer an intruder here. He was a part of it, bound to it and its people by a strange and sacred misunderstanding. He looked down at the music box in his hand, its wood warm from Tushunka's grip. He slowly turned the key. The delicate, tinkling melody rose into the quiet air. It was the same song, but it was transformed. It was no longer just Eleanor's waltz. It was no longer just a lament for his own loss. It was Chaitan's spirit song. It was a bridge between two worlds, a hymn to unexpected kindness, a testament to the fact that in the deepest wilderness, both of the land and of the heart, the most profound connections could be forged in silence and in song. The ache in his chest was still there, but for the first time in a year, it felt less like a wound and more like a space that was slowly, miraculously, beginning to fill with hope. The healing had begun.